Hello again, everyone, and welcome back to Reddit Aliens. I'm John, and as always, thank you so much for being here. Good topic? Let's do it. Urban explorers. What's the scariest or creepiest thing you've ever found while out there? Please remember to like, share, and subscribe. I helped a friend who worked in council housing with documenting flats that were empty. We found some illegal tenants, a mark on the floor left by one who died, and something that I still think about years afterward. A small flat that looked like someone just went to go buy groceries and disappeared, with dinner on a stove, completely rotten by then, and all the flat surfaces covered with sheets of paper filled with a Powerball lottery number prediction system written down by hand. Thousands and thousands of combinations. Above an old clothing store in my hometown, I and some friends discovered an old abandoned apartment. It was still decorated like it was 1965. After letting ourselves in, we discovered a mannequin covered in human shit. It was obvious that someone had taken a huge dump in the toilet, made a huge shitty mess, and covered the mannequin with it. Ran into some methed-out scrappers in an abandoned school at night. I was with a group of like 8, and we had to split into 2 groups. We saw headlamps and yelled over to them, thinking it was the other group. They just turned off their headlamps and started walking toward us. When they saw how many of us there were, they just yelled some shit and left to another part of the building. Old abandoned factory building had a big concrete room that was drawn all over with really freaky demonic runes from floor to ceiling with red paint. In hindsight, maybe drawn by someone with schizophrenia, based on the intricacy and chaotic design. They had a lot of time to cover this room, terrifying to stumble onto with only a tiny flashlight at night. I was more freaked out that someone might have been in there with me that I just couldn't see in the dark. More of a primal fear of another person than anything supernatural. Very spooky vibes. The place is now a condo and supermarket. I was in an abandoned factory 20 years ago. Paper mill? It was huge, had its own train station, laboratory, random machines, and its own streets with intersections. It was like out of a zombie movie. The weird part was that it just seemed as if everyone vanished. We noticed this after an hour or so of exploring. The locker rooms had clothing as if you just took it off, boots still there side by side. You can see the positions of where people were. The lab still had beakers and stuff still full. Some evaporated. Offices had files, desks, had pens. The fridge had milk that expired in 1991 with other food. This freaked us out because we thought maybe we were exposed to some sort of chemical contamination. I never found any information on this place online. Zero. Not a trace of this place. It's now completely gone. Out walking my dog one day, I went off the beaten path a bit and found a small pond near a highway bridge. My dog was swimming in the water, and I was standing beside the pond watching him. I glanced down at the brush around my feet and noticed a pen on the ground, then another, and another. I realized that they were actually all needles, and there were hundreds of them. The brush on the ground was thick enough that I hadn't noticed them when I first walked in. I picked up my dog and carried him out quickly. I still have nightmares about it, and can't drive by the bridge without feeling sick to my stomach. Exploring a large mental hospital / long-term care facility for those with severe mental handicaps several years ago. I made my way into the basement, which consisted of one long, wide corridor running from one end of the main building to the other, with rooms branching off of either side. Some rooms had high windows in them, and the stairwells at either end had windows as well. So both ends of the corridor were relatively illuminated, with a short, very dark stretch in the middle. I walked from one end to the other, poking around in various rooms as I went. Once I hit the dark portion, I stepped into one room, which was pitch black, and snapped on my flashlight. Directly across from me was a wall of body storage freezers. The one room in the place with zero illumination, which I was now standing in, was the effing morgue. I was exploring an abandoned hotel, and as I went to one of the rooms my whole body froze and I had instant goosebumps because there was a blood splatter with chunks of what looked like flesh mixed in on the wall and a body sitting on a chair next to it with a bullet hole growing through the side of its head. But the feeling didn't last long because I realized it was a life-sized stuffed doll, and paint someone had set up. Still felt my soul leave my body for a second, lol. Homeless encampment that was easy to spot by Google Maps next to a huge steel factory with multiple buildings spanning 2 blocks. It was completely devoid of homeless people even on a cold night. One was even telling us not to go in there. I have no clue why they were all staying out of it. Maybe it was the smell of sulfur, or the random noises, or the complete lack of light in many spots. Story from a friend in Austria. Near his town there was an old factory. Everyone in the neighborhood already knew this building, and even private rave parties were organized there. There was only one area in the basement that nobody entered because the door was locked. The door was welded from the inside and outside. After a long time, they succeeded in breaking down the door, and they found a clean surgery room with human-sized cages. They called the police, and shortly afterwards, the room was destroyed. Went to explore this abandoned college campus with my girlfriend. The football stadium was really cool, but then she asked if we could try to get into the dorms. So we find a break in the chain-link fence surrounding it and crawl through. We hop up through a broken window into the building. It's dark, damp, and smells gross, but we start walking around, and it's pretty cool. Just kinda looks exactly how you'd expect an abandoned college dorm to look. It's trashed. I get to the fire stairs, and lo and behold, the door is open. We go upstairs, and the hallway is just piled with trash. It was not like the downstairs, and it smelled like actual death. My girlfriend got scared and wanted to leave because of how bad the smell was. I told her to stay there and crept down the hallway. The first door on my right was cracked open, and the smell was clearly emanating from this room. I could hardly breathe. I peered in and saw the end of a sleeping bag on the floor with what looked like feet inside. I slowly pushed the door open and almost shit myself. There was a guy in the sleeping bag. He was old and obviously homeless. I banged my fist against the door to see if he would react. No movement. Again, but harder, nothing. I quickly turned and told my girlfriend that we were leaving. Although I'm not 100% certain that he was dead, it definitely smelled like it. This is more a comment for the next story you're about to hear. I know some of you in the comments have been concerned about cruelty to animals. This next story describes a kind of violent scene on a dog, so if you want to skip ahead, it's about 48 seconds or so. You could do so. The place they're talking about is Garden of the Gods in Colorado, which is, minus this story, gorgeous. I was there in 2019, and it's a pretty amazing place to hike and explore. So anyway, fair warning, enjoy. Not urban, but a disturbing scene nonetheless. My then girlfriend and I were hiking through Garden of the Gods in Colorado in the early 90s and came upon a really grisly scene. Someone had cut up a few German shepherds and burned parts of them in what appeared to be a ritual. They had also gratified some of the surroundings, tall, thin stones with demonic-looking symbols. Blood was all over, which made me believe they had been killed there and dismembered. Another couple wandered in, and the 4 of us decided they would go to the nearest ranger station, since we stumbled upon it first. Rangers showed up, and when they seemed to be nonplussed about it, I asked if this was something they'd seen before. They said it happens often enough because Garden of the Gods was considered a thin place, which some pagan religions deemed sacred. They said they'd seen this before, but they thanked us for pointing it out because people still hike through there, and it would need to be cleaned up. When I asked if there were any significance that the dogs all looked to be German shepherds, a ranger said that it was a power thing. German shepherds were thought to be powerful dogs, and sacrificing a powerful animal supposedly gave you more power and authority. Lots of scary folk out there. A friend and I, with a couple of girls back in the day in our late teens, we were driving around in our bump bored and decided to drive to a nearby mountain and see the sights. Hoping to get some action after a joint or two, we came upon this old dirt road that came out into a large open area going up the side of a mountain. There was a random gate with a simple latch. From there, you could see an old train depot about halfway up the open area. The area was in the middle of absolutely nowhere and had a lot of history and logging, which the train would have been primarily used to transport lumber and workers. Depot may not have been the right word, as no trains were parked there, but it was a decently sized building with a small booth out front that still had the rusted levers and mechanisms to switch tracks. So the girl starts saying that we should go in and explore the main building, obviously teasing us to see if we'd chicken out, as it honestly looked pretty dilapidated and ominous. But in the spirit of teenage hormones and insecurity, we opened the gate and drove onward. After exploring the booth and the perimeter, we went in. At first it was completely empty, nothing too crazy, but it was definitely eerie. I'm desperately trying to ignore the weed, stoking my paranoia of suddenly running into another person way out here, half for my own sanity and half because of the girl practically on my hip, who I could tell was visibly uncomfortable but trying to play it off. Her friend was laughing and doing the whole boo shit out of the rooms to the rest of us. We get to an area that was once probably a kitchen and see a door that we can only surmise is some kind of basement. We open it slowly. We never made it down. Up to pretty much the first 3 steps is just still water from years of mountain snowmelt. Maybe there were busted pipes that had run long enough before being shut off however many decades ago. I have no fucking clue. All I knew was that the water looked repulsive and smelled worse. The floorboards, feeling somewhat soft, suddenly made a lot more sense than just age. I'm immediately envisioning us falling through the floor of this shithole and getting dunked into a soup of a century in the making. But in the hubris of youth, we kept going upstairs. It was just a long hallway with a window on the end and 2 doors on each side. The light from the window made the doorway seem like black holes, but that may have been the fact that my entire mind is just begging to get this over with and get the fuck out of here. But we hadn't found anywhere near the worst of it. The first 3 rooms are nothing but cobwebs and dust, but the 4th, 2 dirty mattresses that weren't new but too new for this place side by side. Dark stains on them, no sheets. 2 backpacks, one that was just emptied of junk all over the floor, but on the mattress and off to the side were multiple pairs of women's panties with blood on them. What got me is there were different sizes. There was fresh food wrappers too. My gut sank, and I genuinely began trembling. The other backpack had a more masculine look to it and had some clothes visible in the main compartment. My senses immediately flooded with dread, and the feeling of something really bad happened here, get the fuck out now, was overwhelming. I looked at the girl I was with, and she was silently crying beside me, death gripping my sleeve. My friend and his girl were dead silent and wide-eyed beside us. They'd been goofing off the entire time. You could hear a pin drop. We all wordlessly were listening to see if whoever was responsible was moving in the building. What felt like an eternity passed until I snapped out of the panic. The sun was setting. D, we have to move. Fucking hoof it. Don't run downstairs. We'll probably go through. I don't think I'd seen him drive faster, which is saying something. He didn't touch the brake until we were miles away and back into town. Nobody spoke for a good couple of hours. We went about the night, paired off to our own places. Outside of one conversation I had with D about it years later, none of us spoke of it again. I got chills writing this off of memory alone. I was terrified. I enjoy going out looking for wildlife to photograph in the summer, specifically reptiles and insects, which sometimes leads me off the beaten path. One time I was at a provincial park not far from my town and wandered pretty far into the meadow and woods and ended up coming upon someone's property adjacent to the park. There was a small wooden shed with windows on each side. It looked abandoned, It was dark and looked old and weathered, so I wandered over to see if there were any interesting critters. When I get close, I could see the outside of the shed, and the windows were covered in cobwebs and dirt and debris, but then I noticed movement through the window. I figured it was a wild animal and went over, brushed away the webs, branches, and dirt, and cupped my hands to the glass. I saw chinchillas. Lots of chinchillas in small wire cages, one right up against the window, with two of them moving back and forth. It was startling. I realized it was not abandoned, but someone's little chinchilla collection. There were a lot though. I peeked again, and there was no light or anything in the shed, just a few shelves with maybe 10 small cages holding 2 to 3 chinchillas each. I'm guessing it was for fur? At that point, I heard dogs barking and approaching and decided to make a retreat. It was so weird. I didn't report it, I'm sorry to say, because I was kinda not where I was supposed to be anyway, and didn't really know how to get back there afterwards. Maybe it was a happy chinchilla rescue. I don't know. Not horrible, but odd. When I was younger, I lived on a large property of land with my family. There were other properties around, and we were all separated by woods for the most part. One day my dog was lost, so my dad and I headed out around the area to find him. Eventually we came upon a foundation of a home in a very overgrown area, with clear burn marks or damage where the frame met this concrete foundation. The only structure intact was a small woodshed. It was filled with stacks of phone books, pallets worth, shoved into the little shed for some reason, alongside some children's toys and a little trike. In speaking to the neighbors about it, all they said was that it used to be a meth lab in the house, the foundation we found, that completely blew up and burned down, like a seriously large explosion. It was so odd, second to my dad finding a USPS mail truck from likely before the 50s inside the forest that was between our property and our neighbors. It would have been impossible to get the truck out there unless the truck preceded the forest. Overall, super odd stuff, lol. And we did find the dog. I and 2 buddies were exploring an abandoned hotel a couple of months ago. We got in through a broken window on the first floor. I'll skip the boring stuff, but after exploring most of the hotel, we started being pretty loud. I know this was stupid of us. We were walking down this hallway with rooms on either side. The hallway still had light, but the rooms did not. I was in front of the group leading with a flashlight. I got a little ahead of my other buddies because they were goofing off and laughing behind me. As I entered one of the dark rooms, I shined my flashlight in one of the bathrooms. Kneeling down in the corner was a man. I kinda just stared at him in disbelief for 2 or 3 seconds before he yelled, "What are you doing?" and got up and started to chase us. While I and my buddies were running for our lives, one of my friends tripped and fell at the end of the hallway while he was chasing us. We helped him up quickly and practically dove headfirst out the window we crawled through. Once we had gotten a safe distance away, we all just kinda started laughing at the situation. That was the only time we'd ever come across an aggressive person while urban exploring. A few years ago, I explored an old Catholic boys' school in my area. Interestingly, a movie had been filmed there in the early 2000s. One night, a group of us decided to check it out. We split up to cover more ground. I didn't want to go through a hole in the door to a chapel. My brother decided to use a half-broken staircase to go to the upper floors. I wasn't small enough or light enough to do either, and I found myself heading into the basement. The tunnels down there were claustrophobic and dimly lit, but curiosity kept me going. Eventually, I stumbled upon a small, out-of-place room. It was painted a sickly pink, with a single wooden chair sitting dead center. The atmosphere in that room was suffocating, and an overwhelming sense of dread washed over me. I bolted, not daring to look back, and vowed to never step foot in that place again. To this day, I walk past the building a few times a week, but I never look directly at it. I can't shake the feeling that it's watching me. Years later, I heard a group of ghost hunters visited the site. They apparently experienced some bizarre, unexplained shit. And as if that wasn't enough, it turns out the place is riddled with asbestos, making it a hazard even without the ghosts. One place had a stuffed rabbit's severed head stuffed onto a wooden plank in the shape of a human body that was on the overgrown front lawn sticking out of the ground. We walked into an old prison that once housed Nazi generals and was later turned into a boys' school. There were lots of candles around a pentagram, just kids, but it was fun to find. My first exploration when I was an early teen had a lot of chains and hooks hanging from the ceiling in the basement. There was also an upright wooden coffin that one of the dickhead kids trapped a friend of mine in for a few moments. My favorite is when we met with a gawky female explorer who had just moved to our city. She had to prove herself by kicking over a painted-over hinged window to drop down into the basement of an old church and then walk around and let us in. When she got to the door and opened it for us, she was shaking and crying and covered from head to toe in webs and what must have been thousands of baby spiders. We helped her clean off as best we could, but they were in her hair and in her clothes, so we snapped some pictures and got her out of there. She never contacted us again to visit other abandonments. I was looking around a rundown building. My town has many. I was already on edge since technically it was on someone's property. In the middle of what looked to be a living room was a bunch of rocks in a circle with a doll in the middle. I picked up the doll, stupid decision, and I flipped it over. It had sewing on the back. It was one of those dolls that had a soft body and plastic hands and feet and head. In the back of the doll, there were stitches. I undid the stitches with scissors I had in my bag. There was stuffing in it, obviously, and a small paper in it. Not sure what it said. It seemed to be in another language. There was also some hair on the inside of the doll, and that's when I decided I should leave. I set the doll back down in the middle of the circle and I left. I've had a few weird experiences since then, but I stopped urban exploring. Does anyone know what was going on in that house? Exploring an insane asylum in New Jersey called Overbrook. Pretty massive place, super vandalized and tagged up with graffiti. Just walking around exploring. I don't remember exactly where on the grounds I was, but I was inside a building for sure. This place was huge with multiple buildings and some outdoor areas to get to and from. So I'm going through one of the buildings and I walk into this random room and I see it's just super clean, like no trash or debris. I'm like, weird. Then I see on a shelf a whole bunch of clean folded clothes. And then I see a few pairs of shoes next to a few blankets and a sleeping bag. At this point, I'm starting to put two and two together and realize someone has been sleeping here. I noped out of there so fast after that. On parts of the old sea defenses in a town I used to visit, someone had walked the perimeter chalking this weird narrative of memories and accusations and secrets about named people and some fairly heavy stuff as they went. It read like the writing of someone who was clearly in crisis and suffering from a significant degree of trauma. It was disjointed, rambling, and parts extremely paranoid and unlikely, but with just enough repetition of key names and events to convince you that there was a basic truth to much of it. However, much the writer's condition had perhaps embellished the more outlandish parts. There was a kind of logic to it, a solid core around which, and presumably because of which, the weirder stuff had developed. We never found out who wrote it, whether they got any help, whether it was true, or whether the people named were okay. It was a rainy winter, and it was gone by the time we went back. I used to explore an abandoned Victorian mental asylum as a kid pre-internet days. It was a stone's throw from my parents' house, and I spent many summers wandering around it. For the most part, the inmates were friendly, quiet, and just walked around the cricket pitch in the daytime. I assume fairly drugged up. There were no fences, no gates, anyone could walk through it as there was public footpath through the grounds. There was a newly built part for the really insane inmates, and they'd been transferred there, so the large old Victorian ward was slowly being shut down and eventually turned into flats. I and my mates would wander around the wards, still gurneys about, even downstairs. They were padded cells. We'd lock each other in. We used to really shit ourselves as people said it was haunted, and you'd hear noises when mooching around the different levels. They could have been old plumbing or an inmate that had wandered in. Looking back, we were fairly stupid and reckless, but the doors weren't locked, so we'd crack on. We even had a swim in the pool once. It was the only part still used and was heated. The whole thing was scary to us teens. The cells in the basement were really scary. Visited an FWB in Milwaukee. She lived 2 blocks from where Jeffrey Dahmer grew up and 2 doors down from where 5 women were barred and murdered. The houses were actually pretty nice, but the alleys were tiny, and the whole atmosphere was cramped. Between the parked cars, there was barely room to drive. Before I went in, we had some fun in the car, and she made me crouch down because of a guy being rowdy across the street. He was threatening another guy, with their girlfriends watched and laughed, and they almost got in a fist fight. My friend with benefits told me not to move, because if he saw me and knew a girl from his neighborhood was with a white guy, he would try to pick a fight with me. Her apartment had no windows, and her bed was just a tiny mattress on the floor with the AC on, so it was freezing. We heard gunfire once during, and I jerked up, but she told me not to worry because that happened sometimes. The kitchen and bathroom were cramped. That said, the fridge was full, and it was all well lit, though the bathroom creeped the f*** out of me. After all that, it was really nice. I was hungry before, and she told me to relax and made me food. Also, she said if I didn't want to, she didn't want to pressure me, we could just cuddle, but she hoped we could because she really wanted to. I had never actually felt that unpressured before. Plus she cuddled with me, and we slept the night after, which felt so good. And then I woke up, and someone had smashed my windows and keyed my car with the words, "Dead Cracker." I would still see her again if she let me, though. In my hometown, there used to be a drive-in movie theater, and the building that used to be a projection concession restroom was still standing. It had been abandoned for around 20 years, so everything had been stripped out years ago, and at some point, squatters had brought in some old nasty couches and mattresses. We used to frequent the spot pretty often. It was really easy to get to, and since it was a drive-in, it was surrounded by former parking lots turned into thick, overgrown brush that completely blocked the views, and it was pretty far from the nearest occupied building. We would joke that nobody could hear you scream. We used to take new explorers there all the time, since it was very easy to get in and out of, very secluded and hidden, but still pretty creepy. We'd pop by about every month or so. The last time we visited, there was a backpack of one of the couches that wasn't there the last time we visited. It was obviously pretty full of something, so our curiosity got the better of us and we opened it. I wish we never did. Inside the backpack was a shoot kit with drug baggies, needles, a spoon, a lighter, and cotton, along with gloves, rope, duct tape, ball gags, dildos, condoms, lube, and several various sex toys. There were also several items of clothing from a very young girl in the bag, including panties that showed signs of use I'd rather not discuss. We reported it to the police immediately, never heard anything else from it, but it haunts me to this day. In a boarding school in Europe in the 80s, my friends and I explored an abandoned asylum, empty for about 25 to 30 years. Found rooms that had wooden braces holding them closed, tables covered with coloring books and dishes, offices with papers thrown all over. There was a room used for electroshock therapy with photo negatives on the floor. Rooms in the lower levels that only had a concrete bed in it with a small window. What looked like operating rooms filled with equipment and bottles of dried liquids. That's what it looked like to us anyway. This place was like everyone just got up and left one day. Craziest thing I've ever seen. We were caught by the caretaker, who reported us to the school. We were called the Asylum 7. The one time I had the nerve to do any kind of urban exploration, I took my friend with me to explore an abandoned church in my tiny bum Kentucky town. We had to pull aside a board on a window to get in, climb over a toilet with the seat rotted and falling off, and carefully avoid the gaping hole in the floor right in front of it. It was disgusting. It seemed to be structurally sound for the most part, but I was also super dumb and wasn't really looking for stuff like that. But there was a bunch of tote boxes in one room that was filled with a wet sludge with no exploration for why there was any water in them at all. We didn't find anything super creepy, but I got jump scared by a spider and scared the shit out of my friend.